All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Craig Blomberg. Dr. Blomberg is Professor Emeritus of New Testament at Denver Seminary. He is the author of several books, including the brand new Jesus the Purifier, John's Gospel, and the Fourth Quest for the Historical Jesus, out now on Baker Academic. In this book, Dr. Blomberg argues that John's Gospel is a valuable source for reconstructing the historical Jesus by reviewing the so-called quest, discussing the marginalization of John, and demonstrating that the theme of purity in John reflects the ministry of Jesus himself. We will be discussing this book on the show today. Dr. Blomberg, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I was telling you on the show, the very first book on historical Jesus research that I ever read was your book, Jesus and the Gospel. So it's incredible to talk to you. That was, I think, probably 15 years ago or something at this point. But just introduce yourself to my audience. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Well, you gave my title. I have been retired officially for 3 years now, but I continue to teach part-time at the seminary and at other schools, sometimes in person, sometimes by Zoom. Was full-time for 35 years. Before that, taught 3 years at Palm Beach Atlantic College, now University in South Florida. School included undergrad at a liberal Lutheran liberal arts college, Augustana, in Rock Island, Illinois, which was my hometown, at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois, at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Met my wife in seminary, and I say now that I have one wife, 2 daughters, and 3 grandchildren. So is that enough of a start?
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. Well, you have had a very prolific career. You've published a number of books. Your new book, Jesus the Purifier, is you're making a very interesting claim about the Gospel of John and also reviewing the different quests for the historical Jesus. What motivated you to write that book, but then also tackle both the quest and John's Gospel?
I was invited more than a decade ago now. I think it was in 2011 to teach a combined master's level and doctoral level seminar at what used to be Golden Gate Baptist Seminary in the San Francisco area. They more recently have moved to Southern California and changed their name to Gateway. And they invited me to do a seminar on the quest for the historical Jesus. By the time I prepared all my material for that and taught it and mulled over students' reactions and what I could have added, I already began to think maybe there's a book. But then a good friend of mine, a man by the name of Paul Anderson, has been spearheading what at first he just said, might there be a fourth quest of the historical Jesus? And then after about 10 years, he said, I think it's already underway. And I saw that as potentially the last, not just one chapter, several chapters on it, but the culminating point of the quest. And as I say at the outset of the book, I spent the next decade writing what other people wanted me to write instead of this book. Kept poking away at it little by little, and then finally said, right, I got to do this. I got to finish it. Everything else goes on the back burner. And we did it.
Well, I've covered historical Jesus research on my show before, and actually I had Tucker Ferda on a couple of weeks ago, so by the time people are listening to this, they should have heard that episode. But there are a lot of people that listen to the show that are interested in biblical scholarship, but not extremely familiar with it. What do scholars mean by the phrase historical Jesus?
Well, they don't all mean the same thing, but the most common meaning is what can we, with some degree of probability as historians, irrespective of any faith commitments we might or might not have, what can we say with some level of confidence as historians we can know about the man Jesus from Nazareth who lived in the first third of the first century? And that will inevitably mean it's not as much as the Jesus that walked the earth actually did, because you can never find corroborating material for any ancient figure for a lot of what is claimed about them. But what criteria should be used, and that's been widely discussed. What kind of picture of Jesus emerges if we don't just follow our particular Christian tradition and the things they emphasize? Do we get any kind of a different take, helpful take, challenging, radical take? All of those answers have been given over the last 250 years.
So the so-called quest for the historical Jesus, where scholars have tried to reconstruct the historical Jesus from within a modern historical framework, goes back, as you said, at least to the Enlightenment, and maybe even a little bit earlier than that. And traditionally, it's been divided up into three separate quests for the historical Jesus. There are a lot of scholars, including yourself, that have kind of challenged that paradigm a little bit, but for better or for worse, it's the paradigm that we have. Maybe talk to my audience before we review the quest, why the historical Jesus research has been divided up into those three periods.
Well, if you got to write history and make it at all interesting and people can remember it, you've got to schematize history. You've got to divide it into periods, or else you'll write about 75 different scholars or movements chronologically, and people get bored to tears and they'll lose sight of, did any of these relate in any way to any others? You can certainly divide things up topically, and you can say, over the past period of time, there have been a variety of people in most every age who have seen Jesus like X, and then others have seen him like Y, like Z, and so forth. But as it turns out, there have been some defining moments, some enormously influential scholars and works that have seemed to bring one phase of scholarship somewhat to a close and inaugurate another. And in this instance, there seem to be three that are particularly worth commenting on.
Well, let's talk particularly about the first quest. One of the things that I really appreciate about your book that's different than other presentations of the quest for the historical Jesus, because there are a lot of books on this out there that have a lot of good details, but since your book is about trying to integrate John, the Gospel of John, into historical Jesus research, you always kind of have an eye open to how John has been utilized by scholars at different periods in the quest. So talk to us about the very first quest for the historical Jesus, and why, as you argue in your book, the Gospel of John was marginalized as a historical source from the very beginning.
Well, it was the towering figure of Albert Schweitzer at the turn of the 19th to the 20th centuries who wrote the book with the title, at least in English translation, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. Had he not done that, somebody might have come along and divided up the late 18th and the 19th centuries themselves into several different phases, or not done anything until some later point. But Schweitzer, who had double doctorate in both psychiatry and New Testament studies, who was a medical practitioner and a concert organist on top of all that, won a Nobel Peace Prize in the 1950s after decades of work in West Africa doing medical missions. In the earliest years of the 20th century, having read just about anything he could get his hands on in the German-speaking world, and then towards the end began to branch out into some other areas, summarized, assessed what he believed were the strengths and weaknesses of all these different approaches to Jesus, evaluated them in light of his own convictions, came to the conclusion that his approach was best of all, and the people he most complimented were the ones who laid the groundwork for what he did. And the upshot was that whether it's the tradition of the church, Protestant, Catholic, or whether it was some of these freelance 19th century historians, what most people had not adequately picked up was that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet, passionately convinced that the end of the world was near, that he had some role to play in bringing that about, that this was what was called the kingdom of God, that not to be confused with heaven or an eternal state, but that in this world, God wanted to radically intervene, create a people who would help transform the world into a place where God's will, God's ethics would be done, would be seen, would be visible, much more so than at any previous age in history. And unfortunately, Schweitzer believed that because that did not happen in the first century, from one point of view, Jesus' life and ministry could be said to be a failure. But from another point of view, it doesn't appear that Schweitzer believed in an actual bodily resurrection of Jesus. One or two times he gives intriguing hints that just barely leave the door open, that maybe he did. But for the most part, he says, we absolutely know that the Spirit of Christ lives on, and he is the way that God lives in people. Later in his career, he wrote a lot about the Apostle Paul, and Paul was a profound mystic from his perspective. But he would have said it was his understanding of the Spirit of Christ that God had given him in his Christian life that ultimately led to a life of considerable sacrifice, leaving the comforts of Europe for what today is the nation of Gabon in West Africa, but it was simply part of French West Africa in his day, living in a remote rural area, filled with a lot of disease, but concerned to help sick people physically and spiritually. So he's the one who put it all together, created the first quest, and he did such a phenomenal job that whoever came afterwards, historians have not felt belong in that same group.
Yes. Well, and you can definitely tell. I mean, his work holds up incredibly well today. It is still a really good book to read. I want to ask about John in that first phase of the quest, though, because I really do believe, like, of all of the people that Albert Schweitzer would identify as being first questers, it was really only Ernst Renan that made use of John's gospel as a historical source. But from really the beginning, there were a lot of people that said that John is outside of the scope of source material for reconstructing the historical Jesus. What was it about the first quest that essentially set John outside of that framework from the start?
The same convictions that biblical scholarship more broadly throughout that period held. If you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John back to back to back to back, you wind up seeing three narratives that are more similar than different. And then you come to John, and 80+% of what he has to say is not found at all in the first three Gospels, the so-called synoptic Gospels. The style of writing is considerably different. The style in which John narrates things and the style in which he reports words of Jesus are almost identical, but very different from the style of Jesus' words as reported in the synoptic Gospels. Considerably different set of theological emphases, and those data, those observations led many scholars during the 19th century to assume that if the synoptics could be mined for some historically valid picture of Jesus, then you can't have it the way John says. It's just too different.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Well, Albert Schweitzer was definitely a major turning point in historical Jesus research, and the way that the Guild of New Testament Scholarship has been characterized after Schweitzer was that there was this period of no quest where there was just not a lot of people doing historical Jesus research, and then that kind of seamlessly transitioned into what is called the new quest. Now, you talk about how that framework is kind of problematic and not necessarily historically accurate, but that's the way that biblical scholars have understood that phase. So talk to us about the no quest, new quest phase in historical Jesus research and why John continued to be unutilized as a historical source by most New Testament scholars.
Yeah, nothing changes. Although what does change with respect to John, thanks to a little book that was written by an English scholar, hyphenated last name Gardner Smith, was that scholars began to shift considerably to thinking that the reason John was as different as he was that he wrote largely independently of the synoptic gospels. Prior to that, people had just assumed John supplemented, knew what was there before, for whatever reason, didn't want to repeat it. But still, the differences lead to the marginalization of John. No quest, I think, was what N.T. Wright dubbed that period of time when he was revising an earlier work that surveyed the history of New Testament scholarship. People continued to write lives of Jesus, but they were in smaller number. Other factors that contributed to that were the rise of, first in Old Testament studies and then in New Testament studies, something called form criticism, which analyzed places where narratives in Scripture had to have been created based on the circulation of oral tradition in smaller segments, and the conviction, at least with the Gospels, that you could analyze the trustworthiness or the plausibility of those individual literary forms, this parable, that proverb, a particular encounter between Jesus and some opposition, a longer discourse, the different forms, but that they did not circulate together by word of mouth. And therefore, when the gospel writers produced the gospels, they imposed their own sequence for their own theological and literary purposes, but that doesn't help us get back to the Jesus of history. That has almost entirely gone by the board today, 100 plus years later, but it was taken for granted as one of the assured results of scholarship as recently as almost 50 years ago when I was an undergraduate student. Hard to believe it's been that long. And then on top of all of that, the man who stood head and shoulders as a New Testament scholar above most in the world during the middle of the 20th century was a German by name of Rudolf Bultmann, who was also quite historically skeptical, but put a Christian spin on his skepticism that is both fascinating and frustrating. He said, if we could corroborate Jesus of history, then life as believers would not be walking by faith. It would be walking by sight. And so he radically compartmentalized his life as a Christian believer. He was in the Lutheran Church almost every Sunday morning. He faithfully recited the Apostles' Creed, which is part of the weekly liturgy of Lutherans, and in the classroom during the week would affirm that what we can know historically about Jesus from the Apostles' Creed boiled down to one line: crucified under Pontius Pilate. To some of us, that sounds like almost a lobotomy, intellectual schizophrenia. But for Bultmann and a large group of people who followed him for a number of decades after his ministry, it made perfect sense.
Yeah. Well, the reigning paradigm that developed after, well, it really was kind of going on at the same time that the new quest was the third quest. And when I was in Bible college, I went from 2007 to 2012. The third quest for the historical Jesus was still the reigning paradigm, but I remember my professors talking about it as if it was something that had already happened in history, that had already come to a close. But nevertheless, that has been kind of the main framework in which scholars have been thinking about historical Jesus research for the last 30 or 40 years at least. So talk to us about the new quest. What were the basic contours of that and what distinguished it from what came before?
And then on to the third quest from there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the 1950s.
I'm sorry. Yes, the third quest. Yeah, my bad.
Yeah. In the 1950s, a group of Bultmann's former students, now all in universities around the world, had a reunion at the University of Marburg in Germany, where Bultmann taught for many years. And they said, we don't have to be as skeptical as our father, our Dr. Vater, our academic advisor was. We can discuss better the whole issue of criteria for evaluating the historical trustworthiness of something. And they intentionally, deliberately talked about a new quest of the historical Jesus. It did make advances on the previous 50 years or so. It didn't necessarily make advances on the different 19th century lives, although some of those seem to be quite idiosyncratic. There was a growing, if not a consensus, at least a fair agreement on a list of things that you could say Jesus really said or did. But then where do we go after that? And so as you move on in the 1970s, you began to see again, not quite as many people writing on this topic, certainly not as many full-length books. In the 80s, especially with the work of a man named E.P. Sanders in 1985, a book called Jesus and Judaism. There were a few people saying this even before him. What spawned the third quest was the recognition that the anti-Semitism that was so endemic in Germany, the peak of it during World War II, but it didn't start overnight. It had been building for decades, meant that the criteria that were used by the new quest or second quest were those that by design painted Jesus as most different from conventional Judaism. Was that the best way? Was that the main way? Was it the only way to characterize Jesus? Should we not also acknowledge that there were countless ways in which he was like the standard Jewish person of his day? And so if there's one thing that has characterized scholarship from around 1985 to that period of time when it started winding down again, and it's exactly the period of time you mentioned, 2007 to 12. Whatever else scholars did, they wanted to portray Jesus as thoroughly Jewish. Not that he agreed with everything, not that he didn't have some serious conflicts with certain authorities. Not that he didn't have radical views on certain topics, but let's not focus just on those things. Let's not make that dominate. Let's make sure we have a credible Jew at the end of the day.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I got to ask you before we move into Johannine studies generally and the Gospel of John in particular about your chapter on the Jesus Seminar. Personally, that was one of the most fun chapters to read. N.T. Wright, the Jesus Seminar was his big sparring partner in Jesus and the Victory of God. But I thought you did such a great job of highlighting all the inconsistencies with their research. So maybe briefly just tell us about the Jesus Seminar and why they're wrong.
I'm sure they're right on one or two things somewhere. I try to tell my students nobody can always be wrong, but this was a group of self-selected New Testament scholars and a few other people who had begun meeting in the 1980s, on average about twice a year, and had created a clever way that captured media attention of doing their work, where they would vote saying by saying and narrative by narrative, and using colored beads and a jar. Every scholar would contribute on a given passage a red, a pink, a gray, or a black bead. And red meant this is exactly the way Jesus said or did it. Pink meant it's pretty close. This is something that we certainly need to take into consideration when we decide who Jesus was, but it's been altered a little bit. Gray meant there's something at the core that Jesus probably did, but it's hard to be sure because a lot has been altered. And black meant it's virtually entirely invented by the church or one of the gospel writers. And some of the striking statistics that emerged were that only 18% of the sayings and only 16% of the deeds attributed to Jesus were colored either red or pink, mostly pink, and all but about 5 short passages in the Gospel of John were either gray or black, and most of them were black. So there was considerable debate, even at the time in the 90s, the mid-90s, when the seminar published these findings, with people saying chronologically, this comes during the period of the third quest, but in terms of its spirit, its method, its conclusions, it belongs back in the new quest or even in the old quest. It certainly did not create a Jewish Jesus. It created a Jesus who was a sage, a purveyor of wisdom, who tended to speak almost exclusively in short proverbs or in parables. He did not talk about future judgment. He did not work miracles. He did not consider himself to be the Son of Man. He certainly didn't rise from the dead. And so it was very controversial, even among other non-evangelical scholars in its day. But because it was very successful at gaining media attention, and the average journalist, even in the area of religion, had no context into which to put what the Jesus Seminar was doing, it got a lot of press. Again, I can look back to the 70s and the 80s when I studied. It would have been considered rather disgraceful in that era for a university professor to go out and contact religion journalists around the country and say, come see what I'm doing and what I'm involved in. There was the belief that research involved enough objectivity that you did your work, you let your peers evaluate it, and you let the chips land wherever they would fall. This went by the wayside with the Jesus Seminar, and quite frankly, it's been by the wayside ever since. What we see in the political debates of the last 8+ years, while not a direct outgrowth of anything in the quest for the historical Jesus, just represents the same mindset that we don't even strive for a measure of objectivity. We go after whatever our ideology says we want to support, and we use truth fiction and any mix thereof to try to support it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And that's a beautiful segue to the chapter in your book that's kind of like the fulcrum on which your book swings. And this is where you talk about what you dubbed a new look on John. So one of the things that all three of the quests had in common was, as we said before, the marginalization of the Gospel of John as a historical source. But there has always been a group of scholars that have been trying to rehabilitate John and see what it tells us about the historical Jesus. But you also argue in that chapter on the new look on John that Johannine studies has been developing and making real progress, and so is synoptic studies, but those two have not really crossed. So just talk to us about that phenomenon there with the Gospel of John.
There was a Cambridge bishop of the Church of England who in the very late 1950s wrote a journal article buried in a source that no layman would ever notice, called The New Look on John. And his name, also John, was John A.T. Robinson, who was better known in the 1960s for a quite radical book called Honest to God that was one and the same time part of the Death of God movement and the hippie and the drug culture revolution. And one would hardly expect those two sets of interests to coincide in the same individual. But Robinson kept writing. In the 1970s, he wrote a book called Redating the New Testament and claimed there was good reason for every book of the New Testament, including the writings of John, including the book of Revelation, to have been written before the destruction of Rome in AD 70. Well, it wasn't necessarily surprising that somebody might propose that idea, but it was shocking that it would be John Robinson. And then in the 1980s, he began work on a book called The Priority of John, but met an untimely death, health-related. And so a colleague of his then finished and edited and published posthumously in 1985 a book in which, in passage after passage, going through the Gospels with some very detailed care, Robinson said, John's presentation of things here, at least in these certain ways, is at least as credible and sometimes more credible than the synoptic presentation. But he didn't live to defend himself and to build on that. And so it was sort of an oddity. People became aware of it. They read it. They marveled at it. And nobody was pushing them to interact with it or adopt it. And it just sort of died. It really was not until 2002 when a scholar from George Fox University in Oregon, Paula Anderson, managed to propose and have accepted an ongoing seminar at the International Society known as the Society of Biblical Literature that meets annually, attended by scholars of biblical studies from every perspective and no perspective from around the world. And the seminar was entitled John, Jesus, and History. And what would be a good comparison? Maybe Russia, North Korea, and love. The three just didn't go together in most people's minds. John and Jesus, okay, but history, and three large books with, I think, a total of more than 90 contributors have thus far been published. Another one is promised to be out in a month or so at this year's SBL meetings. There are two more in the works that have canvassed a large swath of John's gospel. Not everyone by any means who finds one part trustworthy agrees with everyone who has found other parts trustworthy, but put them together and there is a mountain of scholarship that the Academy really needs to come to grips with, and more people have, but a huge number still haven't, that says we can use reliable criteria and make a good case for John preserving historical truth at many points as well.
Well, this is going to be the big question, obviously, today. You argue in your book that if there's going to be a fourth quest for the historical Jesus, it has to integrate John as a historical source. Why is the Gospel of John historically reliable?
In how many words or less?
That's a tough one.
I have been mentally patting myself on the back that I've thus far taken every one of your questions, each of which could have a book-length answer, and boiled it down to something moderately succinct. Now this is the biggest challenge of all. There's just a whole lot of different reasons, and it's hard to come up with one central unifying thought to them. Some of it has to do with chronology, although John does not seem to intentionally set out to teach us that Jesus' ministry lasted about 3 years. It's only from his gospel that we would ever know that, because it's only from his gospel that we read about Jesus being in Jerusalem more than when he was 12 years old and at the final Passover of his life when he was crucified. And from the different festival times that he went, we can begin to create a very rough chronology of events. Part of it has to do with geography and topography, the literal lay of the land. There are far more place names in John than there are in any comparable length of text in the first three Gospels. And when John includes information about distances or relationship between areas or culture or buildings that have been excavated, he is consistently shown to be accurate with a high degree of accuracy. Part of it has to do with where he apparently, and I say apparent because not everybody would say there are genuine conflicts, though some say they would, where he apparently conflicts with the synoptics. When is Jesus more likely to have cleared the temple, made statements about the coming demise of the temple and how its purpose is fulfilled in him at the very beginning of his ministry, as in John chapter 2? Might a relative unknown have been allowed to get away with that once, since presumably the day after he came in and made a mess of things, everything was back as business as usual? Or at the very end of his life, would he not have been arrested on the spot if he had really done that in the final Passover, is the way that Paul Anderson and some others have argued. Maybe there's a way to have it both ways. And then simply looking at features that make John look not quite so different from the first three Gospels. If our listeners have ever seen a synopsis or a harmony of the Gospels that presents parallel accounts in parallel columns, you go through that and there are page after page where all you see is John, and plenty of pages where you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and nothing in John, and then only occasionally overlaps involving all four. But scholars have done things like going through John, not looking for verbal, literary parallels, but does the main point or emphasis of an episode or a section of an episode have a parallel in the synoptics? And over again, the answer is yes, they do. Even if it's a different event or a different occasion for Jesus' teaching, that mitigates some of the differences. Realizing people have always known this, but just not adequately stressed it, that not one of the Gospels writes Jesus' words in the language he most likely spoke, most of them in Aramaic. As soon as you translate into Greek in a world without quotation marks or any felt need for them, how literally or how paraphrastically do you translate? There was nothing in ancient historiography that suggested it was a virtue to transcribe in a very woodenly literal fashion somebody's words from one language to another. The fact that John's style seems identical when he's quoting Jesus to when he's writing his own narrative is what you find in many other ancient writers. There has been a proliferation of study of other ancient history and biography in the last generation. So these and other details start to add up to that famous perfect storm that people talk about.
Yeah, no, that all makes a lot of sense. What makes your book interesting is that you pick up on a very small theme in the Gospel of John, that of purity, and you show how the way in which that theme is utilized throughout the Gospel could only make sense if it went back to the historical Jesus himself. So I want to ask you, I guess, two questions about that here. The first is, why did you choose the theme of purity, and what does that tell us about the historical reliability of John? What are some ways that we see that working out in the favor of John's historicity?
I set out for myself an exercise, not knowing what would result from it, of going through John chapter by chapter and passage by passage, and aware of what were the most dominant recurring themes in John's gospel, the types of things that more skeptical members of the guild would say, if John made anything up, it's probably this that he's going to make up, because they represent some of his absolutely most dominant themes. And I set for myself the exercise of saying, I'm not going to claim that he made them up, but I'm just going to bracket them. I'm just going to put them on the side of the table, as it were, and see what's left. And then do that repeatedly throughout the whole gospel and go back and see, do I see any patterns in what's left? Or is it just random stuff? Does any of what's left, especially if there are some patterns, not just not fit his major theological interests, but in some ways maybe even cut against the grain of them, which is one of the criteria that's often been used. If you find a gospel writer saying that Jesus is divine, and then you've got something where he seems all too human. He probably didn't make that up because it cuts against the grain of his emphasis. And I didn't know if I would find anything. And if I did, I didn't know what it would be. But one of the things that kept coming up, much more so than you see it coming up in the synoptics, is something having to do with water, especially in the first half of the gospel. In every chapter, virtually, there is something involving water, almost always in the context of the ritual law of Judaism, in which people could become unclean or impure through a variety of things, not all of which were necessarily sinful. Touch a corpse, somebody's got to prepare a corpse for burial, but then you needed to go through a ritual of cleansing. And one of the more amazing developments that continues among archaeologists in Israel, when they're not worrying about rockets falling, is the number of mikvaot, the ceremonial pools for ritual purification, that are being discovered. Just about every wealthy home had one of their own. Just about every village had one or more for the common person to use. And the kinds of stone jars that we read about in John 2 that Jesus used the water from to turn into wine. John even says there were 6 stone jars used for the Jewish rites of purification. Who cares? This is an 11-verse miracle story, and John doesn't even bother to tell us when and how Jesus worked the miracle, other than, when the servants had drawn the water turned into wine and given it to the master of excuse me, when did that happen? The water turned into wine? But it seems that he is making some kind of a statement through this actual miracle, similar to what Jesus himself talked about in the synoptics when he says, you can't put new wine in old wineskins. They'll burst. Something new is here. Something joyful is here. Something related to the age of the kingdom is here. And to some degree, it requires new forms, new receptacles. You see that kind of thing happening repeatedly, and yet never is it the main point or the second main point or the third main point that John seems to be emphasizing. You also see that as you go through the gospel, more and more the references to purity become metaphorical. Jesus is the living water. If you believe in him, rivers of living water will come out of you, John chapter 7. There are enacted little parables like the foot washing in chapter 13, meant to show how the disciples, not that they had to preserve a ceremony of literally washing one another's feet, but were to imitate that in their lives of service and very menial service in serving others. It seems as though Jesus is trying to start with the accepted grounds of ritual purity and little by little wean people away from that to getting them to think much more about moral purity. Well, then go to the synoptics, and you don't find that as a major theme there either. And you don't find water functioning in the same way. But you do find a few stories that aren't in John, like Jesus going out of his way to touch a leper in order to heal him. He didn't have to do that. He didn't do that with most of the people he worked miracles for. And Jewish law says you touch a leper, you become unclean. But instead, the clean Jesus makes the unclean clean. You see that with the woman with the 12-year flow of blood. She touches Jesus, the fringe of his garment, and power goes out, and he senses that something has happened. He hasn't become defiled, but the one who is defiled according to Jewish law has now become cleansed. And so put those data together from John and from the synoptics into something that was very intelligible, very meaningful in early first century Judaism, not nearly as significant as Christianity became more Gentile, certainly not by the end of the first century when John was probably written. And you start to think, this belongs in a chapter, in a book on the historical Jesus. This is something the church has not paid enough attention to. And at the risk of answering the next two questions you're about to ask, how often has the church been more like the Pharisees in being concerned that what's unclean in this world will make clean people unclean, when we should be trusting that the clean can help the unclean to be clean? If I didn't twist my tongue in there somewhere.
Yeah, that was perfect. And I want to come back to that at the very end. I guess the second to last question that I have for you has to do with what we're going to do with this research going forward. So you propose that if there's going to be a fourth quest for the historical Jesus, we have to integrate John's gospel, and that could yield a perspective on Jesus that maybe historical Jesus researchers haven't found before. At the same time, there is a large number of scholars being led by James Crossley, who you interact with in your book, who have proposed the next quest for the historical Jesus. I just got advanced copy of the big book. It's a collection of articles by scholars that are all working on that, and I haven't started reading it yet, but just thumbing through it, it looks like the Gospel of John is not a major component of the next quest. So I want to ask you about, like, what direction should historical Jesus research go in if they are going to successfully integrate John? And then what direction do you think it's actually going to go in based on the proposal of the next quest?
Well, I have never claimed the gift of prophecy. As Amos said, I'm not a prophet or the son of a prophet. I very strongly hope that the John, Jesus, and History people will continue to publish, that some of the obstacles that have led to quite long delays in publication of some of their work can be, I don't know all of what was involved in that, can be gotten out of the way. And I hope and pray that Paul Anderson, who for many years has been poking away at a big book that will do exactly what needs to be done, integrating that which he believes can be shown to be historical in John's gospel with the rest of the gospels. I hope that he continues to make that a priority, that it appears, that it has a good reception. And yes, I'm aware that other people propose other things, and this may be an anomaly that is a blip on the historical radar screen. What's actually going to happen? Well, in our world, and you as a podcaster of all people will know this, who spreads the word the best, the widest, the longest, with the most convincing support, is usually who's going to win out, which may or may not be the person who's right. So let's keep trying.
Yeah. I love that. Well, the final question I want to ask you today, Dr. Blomberg, is, and you addressed this at the very end of your book, and you were kind of hinting at it a minute ago. What impact do you want your work to have on the church? Because while this is definitely an intellectual exercise, and we're trying to do real historical research here, as Christians, we know that this should have an impact on our faith. So ideally, what would you want Christians to take away from this? How should your research in this book shape the way that we think about our relationship to Jesus and the rest of the world?
Well, I gave you the micro picture answer in terms of thinking about purity and corruption in a quite different way. But there's a macro level answer too. There still are an awful lot of Christians. I find them even more so overseas, but still an awful lot in this country who, though they might cringe a little bit if it was said this bluntly, basically have the idea that God said it, I believe it, and that settles it for me. To which, on the one hand, I want to say, I commend you for wonderful faith. And on the other hand, that's going to get you absolutely nowhere with anybody who doesn't start with the agreed on presupposition that God said it. So do you want to just ignore them forever? Or are there ways that we can try to interact and reach some of them? I have been thrilled on those occasions throughout my career when somebody has come and said, your work on this topic related to the reliability of the Gospels or the New Testament is one of the things that really helped me become a Christian. There's no greater joy than that. And I've actually heard that occasionally from bona fide PhD scholars of religion. That's enough to keep you going for a few more years. I'd love to see it have a larger impact that way. And I suspect it has through people who help popularize it. I have met more people who say, I learned about you through Lee Strobel's Case for Christ. And I don't know if that's because he interviewed me in the first 2 chapters and they never got any further in the book, or if they actually read it all, but he knew how to take scholarly ideas and put them down at the lowest shelf so that teenagers and beyond could read and understand them. And that's very significant and meaningful to me as well. So the task of fulfilling the Great Commission isn't over with yet. And this can be one way, one of many, probably not the main way, probably never will be the main way, but one significant way of reaching one slice of people through the power of the Holy Spirit.
Well, Dr. Blomberg, I really appreciate your time today. I've really enjoyed talking with you. The book is Jesus the Purifier, John's Gospel and the Fourth Quest for the Historical Jesus, which is out now on Baker Academic, like I said before. Before I let you go, just tell my audience where they can find your work.
Well, let's see. I could hold it up right here. I don't have a website, if that's what you're asking, but Denver Seminary is where I have taught, first full-time for 35 years and now in retirement part-time for the last 3 years. Just my name in Amazon, and if and when new books come out, hopefully when, you'll discover them there. And of course, if you know a publisher like you mentioned Baker, then you can go directly to their sites as well.
Well, Dr. Blomberg, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.